Even parts of our property are captured in that WEC scheme. But what I propose would embrace the current Ashley River rating area as well. So all Waimakariri ratepayers would contribute a minimal sum to either scheme. I'm not familiar with the detail of the proposed inverted commas flood recovery rate across 3 districts for 2 years, but I would be supportive of that in principle. Looking ahead, the concept should be permanently established with its wider rating base and should be locked in after the initial 2 years. This would provide a revenue base for those missing areas, as well as the other rivers throughout the wider districts. 5, the role of central government. I firmly believe and urge you to persuade all other regional councils to appeal to central government to reactivate the funding mechanism of old, the Vote, Soil and Water, along with a revival of the Soil Conservation and Rivers Control Council, which allocated and distributed the funding to the catchment boards. The benefits of those historical mechanisms were enormous and provided for formalised central government contribution on a regular basis. We should not have to rely on central government to provide assistance just after major events like the Edgecombe, Manawatu, Gisborne, Franz Joseph floods and others, and more recently Ashburton. Record keeping. These big rain events and flooding will continue into the future from time to time. Over the 99 years that we have farmed our property at Ashley Gorge, they occur about every 7 or 8 years. And we've got the records to show that. These are the little notebooks. They typically take about 6 years worth. I haven't brought them all, but the earliest one in here is 1945, 47, 48. And every drop of rain that's fallen in our homestead has been recorded in these books. And we've got the lot. Our family have kept the accurate rain records since 1922, first manually, then in the mid-1950s. The Catchment Board provided a recorder to put it in our garden. My mother changed the chart for them weekly, every Monday morning. And those are the charts, copies of, which you have copies of. So every one of those is a week's circular circumference of the chart. I bought for your interest copies of those charts, just a few of them with those big rain events, because they depict it classically. What a wonderful record to have, showing both the volume and the intensity, and reinforce that these events have happened before. The rain event of 29-30 May was the most intense ever recorded. Not the biggest, but it was the most concentrated and most intense, with 12.5 inches in 48 hours. And 16 inches was recorded back in Lees Valley up in the Township. What a shame there wasn't a chart to show that. From the early 1930s, my father changed the chart at the Ashley Gorge picnic ground at the river flow recorder for the Public Works Department. Every 4th Sunday. It was a 28-day chart. And I can well remember doing that. And he even let me do it when I got my driver's license. This continued with the Catchment Board until who in the 1960s or early 70s, I can't remember exactly when, they put in a solar-powered recorder on our hill, and which beamed the recording straight back to the regional council offices, or the Catchment Board offices. 7, the Braided River Revivery currently underway is very positive, and I thank you for including the Ashley River in this scheme. I think it's 5 rivers it embraces. But this is left over unspent shovel-ready money from other government projects, which runs its course in July 2023, I gather. This underlines the importance to get another funding mechanism in place before then, and it acknowledges the importance of clearing some of these weed-choked rivers for other important reasons as well: environmental, biodiversity, habitat, cultural, etc., etc. Side by side, there needs to be some serious gravel shifting in a few key sections of the river to keep the mainstream in the mainstream. You can't wait for and rely on the next flood to straighten things out. That's not really an option. And the argument I've heard to do nothing and retreat, move the boundary back, and let nature take the river where it wants to go, should be rejected totally and firmly. I'm sure 380,000 people in Christchurch would agree with that, wouldn't agree with the idea of moving the boundary back. You can see below in the appendix, there's a lot of money involved. Costs and losses incurred, repeat of which we want to avoid. We can achieve that with a wider rating base, proper management, and a regular program of works. ECAN has a huge responsibility across this vast region. By and large, it has done a pretty good job. There are a few exceptions. I'm delighted and encouraged by the formation of this committee and the positive contribution I'm sure it will make. It will address gaps, I'm certain. The timing for a more coordinated thrust is right. It is right now. And I urge you to engage with these other regional and district councils and, more importantly, central government and the community to press positively forward. More than happy to answer any questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Robert. Peter.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for your continued passion on this subject, because it's something while you're around, it's not going to go away for us. I know that. So I was interested in terms of the mechanism pre-90, and I might have got this wrong when I wrote it down, Soil and Water Conservation Control Committee. So that committee had the funds to distribute as they were required. They didn't come directly to the catchment boards, is that right?
The mechanism, as I understand it, it started with the Soil Conservation It started with the Soil Conservation Rivers Control Act of 1941. Soon after, I'm not quite sure how soon, but it will be recorded somewhere. Soon after, when the catchment boards were formed throughout New Zealand, they set up Soil Conservation Rivers Control Council. Now, that had representatives on it from all the catchment boards. The late RMD Johnson, chairman of the first North Canterbury Catchment Board, he was chairman for 15 years. I know he was this region's representative on the Soil Conservation Council in Wellington. They were given the funds from central government, blue or red. There was no other colour in those days, but it didn't matter. Both those political parties of those political persuasions looked upon this with equal importance. So it was totally non-political. They had an annual vote, soil and water, just like they have a vote health, vote roads, vote whatever today. Now that vote, soil and water money, that went to the Soil Conservation Rivers Control Council Committee, you might say. They distributed it to the various catchment boards throughout New Zealand. And those various catchment boards throughout New Zealand, they spent it as they saw fit in their local catchment board region. So North Canterbury got some funding, South Canterbury Catchment Board got some funding, the Waitaki Catchment Commission got funding. And that's what I know.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Robert. Yayan, you've got a question.
Kia ora, Robert and Jean. Sorry I can't be in there today, but a little bit of problem with COVID at our local school. So best to be keep everyone safe and stay at home. Robert, just in your point 9, when you're talking about do nothing and retreat, etc. So if you say, because some of the braided rivers are, I suppose, being constrained, and so by a comment of saying maybe we could just widen it out a bit, therefore probably less flooding further down because the river's got a greater area to run. Would you agree with that or against that?
I'm just not quite sure, Councillor, whether I've grasped the subtlety of the question, but if we can remember that rivers like the Ashley were once open and they were braided and clean of weeds over quite a number of decades, that has changed. They're now choked with either gorse or broom or lupins or, in some cases up near us, pine trees, poplars and willows. Now, a lot of the willows were planted for good reason, to protect the integrity of the banks. And some of them are still there, a lot of them are still there, and some of them have been washed out and then dumped in the middle of the river downstream and taken root and grown. Now, that midstream vegetation has been one of the main problems, because when you get a fresh, not necessarily flood, but a good fresh, that can hit those islands and that gets diverted out into the side, true right or the true left. And then you get not a braided river flowing as we would hope it would, but we get a concentration in that corner and then it bounces off there and it bounces over there downstream and you get it scouring out down there and scouring out down there. So I don't know whether that one of my comments help answer your question, but
it does, but also I was just wondering if in some areas, I mean, where there's islands in the middle, and we've kind of realised that we need to get in and do a bit of work, and especially from the gorge down to the confluence with the Okuku there. I mean, that's what you were passionate about. But it was probably more in some areas where the rivers might have been constrained by stock banks, etc. And then maybe thinking. One of the thinkings maybe of the Catchment Committee is in some areas, not all areas, but in some areas we might need to extend those stock banks further out so there's more capacity in the river to carry flood waters, which probably in the future with COVID, with climate change, there'll be more shorter rainfall events but larger quantity of water.
Yeah, I see where you're driving. I don't totally dismiss it. I have some reservations about it because these rain events haven't just suddenly happened in the last 20 years since this population in this country or the wider population globally have realised that this has something happened to our climate. These, as our records show, these climatic events, like the rainfall events and the consequent flooding, they've been happening for hundreds of years. That's how the Canterbury Plains were built up. But if you look at the other natural events, the wind events, they didn't suddenly happen this last decade. They've been happening for hundreds of years. And I could recount the ones that I've experienced. The first big one was in 1945 when I was 5 years old. And subsequent to that, or the big snow events, and they're well recorded in the mid-1890s. And then the next big one was in 1918, just 6 months after they settled 21 new settlers on 21 rehab blocks, the first rehab farm settlement scheme in New Zealand, in the summer of 1718. And most of them got cleaned out in July 18 with a massive snowstorm. And then another one in 45 and another one in 1973. So we talk about climate change, and I agree that there are some signals out there, particularly on the polar caps, which are very, very disturbing. But I'd hasten to say that a lot of these extreme weather events have happened before. And one of my forebears, 200 something years ago, was commanding the good ship Chatham with Robert Vancouver in his ship as they came through the Cook Strait and got separated in a massive storm in 1792. And my forebear was pushed into the northern part of the Chathams, and he was the first European to set foot on the Chathams. And the Chatham Islands was named after the brig that he was sailing, the Chatham. So my knowledge and history of early New Zealand goes back to as far as that, 1792.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Robert. I just wanted to, and thank you for your explanation about the early funding for the catchment boards. Through that, I just wondered though, with the Soil Conservation Council being a body who could allocate the funding, was that done on a sort of a subsidy basis for the different catchment boards, so that some of the funding came from rates and local government or through the catchment boards, and some from central government? Is that how it worked?
The central government gave the Soil Council, Soil Conservation Risk Control Council, a block of money. I don't know how many millions it was, but they gave Soil Council a block of money. The Soil Council deliberated in their great wisdom as to where that money should go from Northland to Southland, and the various catchment boards throughout the length and breadth of New Zealand. It was then that the local catchment board, in my case, the North Canterbury Catchment Board, they either identified for themselves or agreed with representation to them to give subsidized monies to various schemes. Now, typically, if you qualified in their view for a river protection works, and we used to do about 5 or 6 changes a year, you had to put up your local share. And we would put up about £500, and that represented you've got a 2-for-1 subsidy, less 7.5% on cost. That was the administration fee, I think. So the farmer had to put up, well, probably 40%. If you're getting 2-for-1, it wasn't less the administration. But that went a long way when it was, £500 in the 50s, 60s. And then it was 1-for-1. Sometimes it was even 7-for-1 subsidy. The Floodgate Creek, I think it is, in Kaikoura. Some of you may be familiar with it. But I think Floodgate Creek in Kaikoura got 7-to-1. That's how bad it was and how important it was to fix it.
Just a quick question, Robert, about the current work that's going on, clearing the willows from the main fairway. Do you think it's going to be important that we ensure that after that work's done, that there's perhaps a progressive increase in the side, those willows that are still remaining in the sides, to make sure that we can broaden that braided component a lot more than just the central fairway?
Well, I would hope that the guidelines of your braided river revival are wide enough to accommodate some braids for the future. I don't think that you should be looking ahead too far to spend a lot more money to extend those braids out. Let's get that first channel clear. Let's get that first channel braided and flowing in a braided manner. You'd have to take each section of the river on its merits, I think. But what I'm a little concerned about is that there's a thinking developed and locked in where we walk away from them and move back, draw a new boundary.
Thanks, Robert. Look, and look, if I can just note that what your advice to us has been that we should review the catchment rating system for the Ashley River and other rivers in the region, and we are doing that already. So thank you for your advice on that. I note your support for the flood recovery rate, albeit at a high level. I also note that you agree with that we are proposing to central government that they put co-investment back into flood protection as they used to do back in the day, and so you clearly support our positions on that. So thank you for that. And your as you say, to restore our breaded rivers, our first priority should be to clear the exotic vegetation that is cluttering up the rivers and limiting their ability to behave like breaded rivers. If I can move that it's that the Catchment Subcommittee recommends that we receive the deputation from Robert Johnson regarding agenda item 7.1, Catchment Subcommittee report on river ratings in Canterbury and the rating structure. Do I have a mover for that? Thank you, Peter. Grant seconded it. All in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against carried. Thank you, Robert and Jean, for coming in. Thank you for giving up your time to come in and help us with our deliberations.
Well, it's time that I'm very willing to donate and happy to help any way I can. But some of these photographs pretty dramatic. Oh, thank you. Yep, that's great.
Right. Well, we might just carry on. The minutes of our last meeting have been circulated. Can I have a mover? Are there any suggestions that they are not a true and accurate record of our last meeting? And if not, can I have a mover and a seconder that they be recorded as a true and accurate record? Thank you, Claire and Liz. All in favour that these are a true and accurate record, please say aye. Aye. Against carried. Are there any matters arising from the minutes that will not otherwise be brought up in the meeting? No? Cool. Okay. Oh, yeah. I'll just note that in terms of the matters arising, that the recommendations, the two recommendations that we've passed. Hang on, how many recommendations have we passed? The two recommendations to do with funding flood recovery and potential options for rating changes for flood recovery are going through to the Natural Environment Committee for consideration. Right. So if we could move on to the Catchment Subcommittee report. Lee, are you presenting that? I call you forward, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just go through and highlight some key points in the report. So the first section is on flood recovery, and I'll just draw your attention to the fact that we do have some significant tenders out at the moment for flood recovery as we move into a more permanent repair stage. So they're mainly for the Aorari, Waihi and Hakatiri rivers, which had the most significant amount of flood damage in the event earlier this year. We've also been holding a number of rating district committee meetings, which I'll cover at the end, and gravel demand remains very steady. We know there is a significant interest in receiving the LiDAR information. We have partnered, we've been fortunate enough to partner with Canterbury University through the Waterways Centre on obtaining this LiDAR, which has saved the ratepayer well over $120,000. And they are apologetic for the delays, but a number of rivers are due next week. So hopefully that's not too far away. And I'll just draw your attention also to the flood frequency estimate table, which has been prepared by our hydrology team. This is now publicly available, or it is, although it is going through a final peer review process. And interesting on the table is that at least 12 rivers had their maximum recorded flow on record, and you'll see at least 8 rivers had an event, a return period of 200 years or greater, which just illustrates the significance of the event right across the region. The next section is on scheme amendments, amalgamations, reviews and reclassifications. There is quite a bit of interest in this, particularly post-flood, as people wish to consider other models. So there's a little bit of background in there on rates and the different kinds of rates, as well as the differences between a scheme review and a reclassification. I'll just acknowledge that the current system and changing it is very, very complex and time consuming. And we do know there is a desire to look at simpler models, which is something that staff may be able to look at going forward. 2 major scheme reviews for the Ashley Rakahuri and Kaikaura are almost complete, and they'll be completed this financial year. The Rangatata scheme review is underway, and it does include implementation of some flood works, thanks to some COVID recovery money. In the infrastructure strategy, in the 30-year infrastructure strategy and the long-term plan, we are programmed to start the Opihi and the Selwyn Waikirikiri scheme review this financial year. No work has started on that yet, and we're looking to bring some consulting resource on in the second half of the year to look at those. We are considering, given how big flood events have, the big flood events that have occurred this year, if we do need to alter the order of the scheme reviews or accelerate others as well. So staff are just currently giving that some consideration. Excuse me. The climate resilience program to support the COVID-19 recovery is progressing well. And I'll just highlight that we have now completed Canterbury's first project, which is on the Waimakariri River at Macintosh's Bend down near Kaipoi Township. This was a significant rock work and also included many biodiversity and recreation enhancements. We've had some very positive feedback on that from the community. And our second project, the Waia Township Stop Bank Rebuild, is very close to completion. It should be completed this week or next week, which has also been very well received by the community. Braided River Revival, Whakahamanu na Awa Pākehī, is progressing very well. We did provide an update last time on the 9 Braided River plans and our work towards our regional river strategy, which will kick off in the second half of the year. The main highlights in this section for today around a science report on the land use change on the margins of lowland braided rivers from 2012 to 2019. And I'll just acknowledge staff member scientist Helen Greenup, who's in the room, who co-authored that report, as well as the Director of Science, Tim Davey, who's also present, in case there's some questions on the report later. So the report does highlight how special and significant our braided rivers are, but there has been encroachment on them, primarily through agricultural intensive use in some of the braided river margins, which continues to be an issue. The regional parks has had a forestry focus over the last few months, particularly given the Windthrow event, and they have also been doing some experimental perpetual forestry involving native plants on the Ashley Rakahuri, which is quite exciting, and work to recover from the May flooding is continuing in terms of silt removal and working with stakeholders to get parts of the park open. Gravel management, I've already highlighted, is a hot topic in Canterbury, particularly post-flood, and we are organising a gravel liaison regional meeting for the regional committee for early December. The draft date for that is the 6th of December, and staff are just looking to finalise that and get invites out. Financial implications in regards to flood recovery will be presented again at 2 workshops next Wednesday, one with Selwyn District Council at their request and one with yourselves and mayors and other partners and stakeholders as well ahead of your deliberations through the annual plan process. In regards to engagement, we have held a significant number of rating district committee meetings over the last month. I just noticed that the Rangatata meeting is missing from the list that was held on Tuesday this week. So all those meetings have now been held with the exception of the Ashburton meeting, which is to occur on the 30th of November. Attendance has been a little bit light at some of the committee meetings, but they all have been well received and they all did appreciate an update on the works that have happened in the river post-flood, and they also were pleased to see a financial update, and also there was discussions with them and general support for the concept of a flood recovery rate, particularly given the impact that the flood event will have on some of their reserves. And we also did discuss with them the concept of introducing some funding for out of scheme works, which was also understood by the committees. There was general acknowledgement that this is the most significant event that we've had since 1986. It was a regional event and it is very rare for NEMA funding to be triggered. It's certainly the first time in recent history that we've had, the flood event has been big enough for ECAN to claim NEMA assistance. So there was acknowledgement that the event was extraordinary in that sense. And I'll just highlight the attachments. There is some attachments on the climate resilience program in terms of project highlights for the last 3 months from July to September, as well as attached is the land use report on braided river margins, which I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Look, if we just hold over the questions on the braided rivers paper and just focus on any other issues that anybody would like to ask Lee. To start with, Peter.
Just a comment, Lee. I think that the meetings are held at a better time than trying to rush them through at the start of the year. So I don't know if you intend to do that again, but the timing of those meetings for me anyway, and it's been pretty good.
Thanks, Peter. Phil. Oh, yeah. Sorry, John. Yeah.
I guess just as a follow up to that, yes, it's convenient time to have those meetings. But folk were certainly going, we haven't actually started our program for the year and we're talking about a budget for next year. And so I guess there's a wee bit of a challenge in that works haven't been done, trying to set budgets for another year out. So I absolutely understand the usefulness of when we've met, and it's probably that second meeting in the year would be helpful. But there are some challenges about budget setting so far in advance.
Thanks, John. Phil.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report very much. I just wanted to ask you about the need for reclassification of a number of the schemes. And you're saying that in the report very clearly that it's necessary. And it in between the lines of the report, where you really allude to the fact that there's perhaps some kind of shortage of a skill shortage in that complex area. And you referred to us to the long-term plan and funding that's in there, but I'm just wondering, in fact, is that partly a matter of resource sort of capacity? That's the question, really.
So the reclassification, it's a very niche skill set. So Environment Canterbury has 2 staff members that are experienced on it. One's about to retire and the other one is focused on flood recovery. So we do have some knowledge and skills in-house. It is exceptionally hard to find anyone external unless they're an ex-regional council, someone that's gone consulting, that has been in the game for a while. So at the moment we are light on resource in that area, and given it is quite complex, I guess we've been asked to turn our minds to could it be simpler, which is something that we'll consider.
also bring that issue to us at the time of the annual plan? Or is there enough funding there for
No, I think, Phil, the issue of reclassification probably sits alongside, when it's appropriate, the river reviews, and that we might reflect on when you do a river review and there's a request from those people on that river for a reclassification, we might look at then the option of doing it then. And yeah, I'm old enough to understand the classification system, unfortunately. And I wonder whether actually it's as relevant now as it was in 1945 when a lot of those classifications were put in place, and whether in fact there is scope, given the difficulty of getting staff who know what they're doing about this, whether in fact we need to be as complicated as it has been in the past. But we've asked the staff to come back to us on and give us advice on that. Grant.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's an opportunity here to look at, we've got a whole of our river strategy, whole of river strategies, Te Mana o Te Wai and the NPS and what we've got to look at. So really, I just look at the little map there on page 27. There's an opportunity to look at the whole of the corridor and the contributions to and the way that those rivers are managed and the adjacent berm areas and adjacent land, and you treat it all as one, and just see if there's a mechanism. But it'd be good to come, for you to come back to us. We'll have a bit of a workshop and a bit of a discussion about what people's views might be on that. But I know that in Waimakariri, I'm a water drainage, central rural drainage group, and the other drainage groups in Waimakariri have been keen for a long time to have a single rating, just for the whole district. So, and if that doesn't happen, then it's a corridor approach, in my view.
Thank you, Grant. You don't want to make a comment about that? No, that's right. You don't have to. I would add that though that the paper on co-funding from central government, co-investment from central government, actually does Basil Chamberlain's paper. Can you refer to that? Does refer to the fact that there's significant differences, significant changes since a lot of the flood protection schemes have been put in place in terms of assets protected and the expectation of those new assets in terms of the level of protection. And that is something that actually might lead to a need to reclassify in many of the catchments. And I suspect that's certainly true of in the Ashley, and it may well be true in other rivers. Yayan.
Yeah, agree with the. Oh, someone's got their mic on, probably you, Ian. Yeah, agree with because the map on page 27, I think it was, and just having the 8 different classifications there. I mean, at Wairewa, when we first tried to put our scheme in there, that we had a picture similar to that, and it didn't go through. We lost by a couple of votes. Then after 2014, when we did have the flood, we ended up with a single figure. I think it might have been a UAGC. You have to remind me of that one. But yeah, so we've got a one fee or etc. on our rates bill now for the Wairewa scheme, which makes it so much easier. Kia ora.
Thanks, Jan. Catherine.
I was just wondering whether, as part of your annual plan consultation, whether we might ask some broader questions around whether you would like the status quo, whether you would like to continue some sort of classification, or whether you'd like a catchment arrangement, and whether we can get that guidance through the annual plan, rather than doing a whole pile of work and being really technical about it. Yeah.
And maybe the workshop next week could, when we reflect with some of the chairs of the catchment committees and mayors, they may have a reflection on that. Any other questions? I've just got one question on the jet, item 42, I think it is, Lee, on the jet boat ramp. what is actually happening there, and other, no, 41 it is, sorry. It says the Jet Boat Association have been involved in this. Are they happy with what's being proposed? And
my understanding is our park rangers and engineers have met with the Jet Boat Association and talked about what physical works could happen to improve the situation at the jet boat ramp, and that those works are starting to proceed, and they'll just be monitored for success and if anything else is required going forward.
thanks, Lee. Claire.
I'm not sure whether it's associated to the jet boat ramp as such. And certainly there's been great silt deposits there over the last 6 or 9 months. The vegetation that's been removed upstream, is that part of a perpetual forest, or is it actually this vegetation that they're talking about? Because they've taken out quite a considerable amount of vegetation, not right at the river's edge, because the willows are still there and they're look to be getting undermined or being challenged. But there's certainly a lot of vegetation being removed from what looks to be a reasonable area. And I'm just wondering whether it's associated with this or some separate regeneration plan or something going in there.
The vegetation removed above the jet, upstream of the jet boat ramp, it's not, I guess, formal forestry. It is, some of it was flood protection vegetation that wasn't required, or other, just some bushy growth. I'll have to get specifics about the general area. I can provide those to you if you'd like.
Thanks, Lee. My memory of the discussions with the Jet Boat Association is they were concerned about the height of the water in the river, which seems to be permanently higher and therefore reducing the amount of area on the ramp to launch boats. But I guess that will be addressed, but we'll look for further reports of satisfaction from the Jet Boat Association. Yeah. Look, if I can now perhaps ask Helen to come up to the table, and I know there are some questions of your report for your report on the Braided River land use change on the margins of lowland Canterbury Braided Rivers. As I understand it, all the members of the subcommittee have read and digested the report. Other questions? Lan, I think you had a.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Thanks for this work. Just another, I guess, depressing report. My question was around what are we doing, or what do we do about this report? And it's really around focused on essentially Bragg as like a good starting point for somewhere that this kind of report would go, and then would be able to be actioned in some way by the various agencies. But it's also about, I had questions, so interested in where Bragg is at and where we're going with that. And Stephanie has kind of updated us in terms of like it's essentially on hold, but you know, does this report sort of electrify it back into life, for example? And then my other questions are around just sort of more the sort of so what, like what are the repercussions of this, and more specifically around 1/3 of the developed land being in public ownership, and interested in whether that is just because it's mostly leased public land, which has been intensified in that way, or are there actually areas of concern that we might need to take some form of action?
I'll work backwards, so that first one last one first, sorry. The public land, we didn't go into whether it was leased or not. My guess would be that some of it may have been done under release agreements and some not. So, but there was no analysis of that. I've lost count of where I was now.
So maybe further to that, is there like, for example, say, mapping layers that you have that inform this report? Is there, for example, scope to like overlay the different agencies' land, or the little that is known of where the different agencies' land is, whether that be Lynn's, Doc, or the TAs or us, and then from that sort of, you know, highlight areas where potentially there has been more concerning action than maybe others?
Yeah, so we can do that. We can work out who, as long as it's recorded, we can work out whether it's Lynn's, Doc, or ECAN, or potentially a district council as well. We haven't done that yet, but we could easily do that. And then I guess the next step from there would be to, because one thing is we can find out who owns the land of the public stuff, but we can't necessarily find out whether it's leased or not. That would be a conversation with Lynn's or with Doc, or obviously we can do it with ours. But yeah, we could.
And so is that potentially where Bragg could come in to hold this conversation?
Yes, so our understanding is that our CEO is trying to meet with Doc and Lynn's before Christmas to advance the Bragg conversation.
I guess, you know, like this is a really concerning report, just because we don't have those kind of further details. And I you know, note that there has been struggles to get really good engagement with the other public agencies, primarily Doc and Lynn's. And you know, I just wonder if there is actually a need for something from our council, for example, to say to the agencies in terms of a political body that we really want to see action here, or to the ministers or something like that. So I guess it's more a question for us as this subcommittee, what we might like to recommend, if anything, to council to elevate this and really get Bragg engagement with the other agencies.
Thanks, Marnie. Peter, you had a question.
So my understanding in terms of where we're at with this is that we had pretty good alignment on Bragg with Liz and Doc, with Minister Sage at the helm. And when the High Court decision came out regarding margin, then we didn't really have a place to stand with that. I mean, I know that Lynn's at that stage were pretty keen on joining another case with us and going forward, and Doc were not far away from that either. But my impression is that until we get that piece of legislation that's clearer about braided rivers, then we really are hamstrung in terms of how hard you can push in this space. Now, is that your understanding?
That would be mine. Yeah, one of the things that I would like to see would be to have a formal definition of a braided river that, you know, is fit for purpose. And then we can, you know, we can then sort out whose responsibility it is.
And I think we were even, I can remember Tom Lambie and myself talking to Minister Sage at Lynn's about the fact, and also with Craig Harris, about the fact that that land, that the forgotten land, if you like, the land that we're talking about, really needed some stewardship, and we were happy to take that under our wing on their behalf, and they seemed pretty comfortable about that. And then this other legislative call got in the road, and I think it's just all stopped. And I think you're right, Lana. I think we need to take Stephanie's direction on this, but something needs to be done because we lack any ability to move forward.
Claire, you had a question.
Look, mine's on the same theme as Peter's just alluded to, and I'm just seeking clarity really. You talk about it in your intro around braided, what's it, braided plants? I didn't had had it highlighted on my PDF, but I haven't on my docs on that. But it's really just the definition that you've actually used and aligning that with, for example, the graphic on figure 1.1 there, and thinking about when you looked at these maps, or when whoever's done it, was it within the current grade plane? Which I'm not thinking that it was entirely, because you actually do talk about historic in the definitions. So, and it sort of fits in with Peter. It's around having that definition and the clarity that we can actually do anything. So it's not only us that may be frustrated, but also landowners or people that have got valid title of ground, Where do you draw the line? And also then the definitions of different vegetation. And I mean, these are not, as I understand it, been verified. They're just from your aerial and satellite maps. Is that correct?
Yeah. Okay. Catherine, did you want to comment?
I was just going to go back to Lan, third chair. So around Bragg, and look, the work that was done with Bragg has not been wasted, and it's being incorporated into the Rangatata. So that's our first, I guess, catchment that we're working on in that new framework that we agreed through Bragg. So yes, as we go through other rivers, then we'll hopefully continue to use that framework.
So,
Thank you for the report. I've just got a couple of questions too, if I may. So, just like you refer to the developed agricultural land and intensive agricultural management, and then you also have the table around designated reserve land as against private, freehold and unalienated. But just what I wondered is, could you just tell us about any farming sort of methods or type of farming on any of the Environment Canterbury's reserve land, how that is run, because I don't know.
I can help a little bit there with that question. So Environment Canterbury does own a substantial amount of land throughout the region. Most of it's vested for flood protection purposes as a way to generate income and offset rates. There are various types of leases, from industrial to farming leases, and our property team has been working, I guess, in the best practice space over the last few years to look at leases that, when they are renewed, renewing them for shorter periods while we work out if they should have some different conditions on them, and also in anticipation of potentially retiring them from farming and turning them into forests or something else. I've just lost my train of thought. They are required to get their own resource consent, so the leases do have conditions above and beyond the resource consents that they have to obtain themselves.
If I may, just so when there's a current lease in place, and for example, there's it's been used agriculturally, are we able to talk with the leaseholders around even reducing some of the intensification, that kind of approach? Or are we able to do that within the terms of the leases?
It would completely depend on the term of the lease. There are review clauses and things they can and can't do, and some of them are only for light grazing, for example. It's the older leases that are, some of them are in perpetuity, or older ones that are more of an issue, but there's less and less of those at the moment.
So if I can just help Lee as well, and refer you back to a paper that I think Miles brought to us when he was talking about land assets that ECAN owned, and with potential forestry, with forest potential. But what he went through was the list of land that ECAN owns, leased out, and there were various. There's a lot of different leases and variations in terms of value, land use, and rights from the landowners, from the tenants, I should say. So I could refer you back to that paper, because that explains the complexity of actually all the land that ECAN owns and the different levels of lease and and length of leases and everything else. Grant, you are next.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like in terms of our whole of river approach, the idea of having really good data, GIS information, Canterbury maps and overlays that, and I just think looking at what we've got here, determining the corridor. So you've got a physical analysis of what's happening, and the land management issues can follow, if you know what I mean, in terms of how you manage it, whether it's on private land, other agency land or our own land. But by having some overlays to say, well, okay, the historic thing is this wide, is you take that as the corridor, and the management between it is done in a certain way. And then where we are now, we're in a little piece that has more active management, if you like, and you can then assess the risks and opportunities within a broader mountains to the sea corridor. That's the way I would really like to see it, because then it has all those land use things about joined up forestry, joined up recreation, joined up linkages, land management on similar soil types, and it becomes economic and social, environmental, cultural, all in one. But so for me, it's how much information have you got that you could do that relatively quickly on a desktop exercise, and that becomes the basis for your strategic approach to the management of the river, and you fine tune it after that. But it's like, what is the spatial thing? And I know the government has, in terms of the RMA, the spatial component of that, the Spatial Act. We don't really know what's coming out of that. But that's another thing that actually we could be ahead of the game in terms of river management. You know, that's just my view. But, you know, discussing those things in a bit of a workshop would be great.
Craig, and then Liz. Craig.
Kia ora. Yeah. Hey, I know in the paper on page 30 that there's two next steps mentioned. One is obviously to work with the partners and territorial authorities. Sounds good. And then the other one is to seek sort of an opportunity through the reforms to potentially look at a review of the definition of riverbed. They're both good things, but I'm probably a bit like Lan and a bit concerned about where we're at with this. And I understand that it's complex, of course it is, but I probably would like to understand a bit more or get some advice on some more. I don't know. I don't want to say concrete, but some more actions on this and some more steps that we can take. So I'd be pleased to hear some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Liz.
Yep, just two things. Well, I originally had just one thing, but the point that Phil raised, I just want to let you know, Phil, that ECAN land use for conventional dairying gives us 500,000 per annum rental. It's in Rakaia, Rangatata and Kaikoura. And dairy support land, we also have dairy support land, winter grazing and other grazing. And I just got that information from asking Miles last year. So I can send that through if you want. What I was going to say was I'm interested to know how the change from sheep to dairy has changed the areas around our rivers. And so I'm sort of thinking about, do we have any mechanisms to regulate land use adjacent to rivers? So it's still farmed, but it's not farmed with dairy. And I guess I want to know is, did you have a feel for whether there was any sort of unintended consequence coming through of the regulation for farming, for fencing off waterways? You know, has this kind of impacted the way that farms are kind of organised? And do you sort of see what I'm getting at with that?
That never occurred to me at all. But yeah, because I mean, braided rivers tend to be obviously not fenced because there's sort of physical barriers, or you know, there'll be fence that are at a sections along the way kind of thing. No, I haven't. I mean, I haven't really thought about fencing sort of streams and stuff going. Are you talking about sort of tributaries and stuff that go into them?
I suppose I'm sort of talking about the change in farming that's occurred and whether, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know because you would know. I guess you're saying there's not as much fencing of graded rivers, and so now there's just, presumably farmers just put their fences there, and then the river's there. But I just wondered about the change in the type of farming as opposed to. But maybe have a think about it and get back to me.
Look, I just wonder whether, in fact, you're asking a question of Helen where she is not qualified to answer. But Lan, you had a
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I just had another question which I forgot. It was just about the dates in the report about like when it was actually prepared and reviewed and then externally reviewed and then approved. And am I reading it right that like it was reviewed in September and October 2020 last year, and then externally reviewed December last year, and then I assume the prepared means like it's out of draft and it's like actually, and then it's approved October this year. Is that right? Yeah, and is that just like resourcing? Because I guess it comes down to why I really noticed that is because, especially for us, we need this kind of timely information, and it would be of concern to me why this kind of delay happened, and is it resourcing or is there something else going on here that I just felt like I needed to ask about it because it seemed like a long time.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot of time. I think what happened is it sort of coincides with when Tim was, there was a switch in staff. So Tim stopped being, what's the position? Chief scientist, and Fiona came in, I think December last year or January this year. And I just think it's, I don't know for sure, but my impression is just getting to know her role, and perhaps there was just quite a few to get through along with other stuff. But that's
cool. No, that's helpful. I think maybe it's just like a sort of broader, it raises a broader sort of process question, particularly when it comes to science and the way it moves through the organisation, that it shouldn't necessarily be on one person. If there has been, our scientists have prepared a report, it's been reviewed, it's been externally reviewed, wouldn't it make sense in a situation like that where there's a role changing over or something like that, instead of there being, almost a year delay, that it actually having a different process that it can go to someone else who can sign it off so that we as the governors can act on that earlier and get that kind of information? Because I would just hate to think, something like Otu Wharekai, we've got this really good information, but we know that we're like potentially too late, and it's actually the urgency of the information that is so key. And I think we just maybe need to look at that a bit.
My understanding is that the science management team are doing exactly that.
okay. Right, thank you. Phil, last question.
I just want to make a comment.
Comment. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Well, if there's other questions, I'm happy to wait.
No. Last comment.
Well, others might too, because, and I think Craig does too. But
I'll come back to Craig.
I wanted to support Lan's concern earlier around the urgency of this. Like, I thank you very much for the report, but in a way, I'm new to this. But I find the impact of the intensification of farming around our Braided Rivers area is just over the top. And I do note too, and you did a very good executive summary for us. But the penultimate paragraph in the original report is very concerning. Like the statement there is this ongoing loss, and this is cumulative effect of intensification. It shows that we're not yet meeting the outcomes intended under the policy 10.3.2 of the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement to preserve the natural character of the river and lake beds and their margins. And neither, the other one too, is we're not meeting the target for the Canterbury Water Management Strategy to maintain the braided river characters of Canterbury's rivers. So, you know, in some ways, I sort of knew all this, but seeing it down in black and white and the very hard and good research behind it, I find shocking actually. And I would like to go back to Lan's point about what other action besides noting these things can we make in order to, I guess, presumably invite central government to support us to actually have this addressed. And I would like to find a process so that we can do that.
So look, look, we'll go to Craig's question because Catherine, you wanted to have a crack at that. Or Lee?
I was just going to suggest that we do a bit more work on what else we could do and bring it back to you at one of your meetings next year.
Okay. Does that deal with Craig's?
Yeah, and the other thing I would note, obviously, in the note, which says that, you know, we're going to grow through the national planning reforms. So that's the way to get that margin, the definition of a correct, to enable us to do what the plan says we need to do. Yeah.
And look, if I can just make one closing comment about this, although the paper focuses on the effect of agriculture on the margins of the river, you need to remember that our Kainga depot was in what could be described as part of the riverbed. Most of the industrial estate in Ashburton, including the new swimming pool, is definitely down in the riverbed, and so a lot of the development isn't just agricultural development. So you need to have if you're going to be indignant, you need to be unbiasedly indignant. And old chap said to me the other day, every time I go past this new swimming pool in Ashburton, I chuckle because I used to swim there when it was a river. Right, now we've got two notes. I want to wrap up this meeting now. We've had a good discussion. We've got two notes to note. The first is that the first co-funded project to support COVID-19 recovery is now complete, and that's the Waimakariri Macintosh's Bend project. And the report on land use change on the margins of braided rivers and the intention to engage through national planning reforms. And so it's been identified in the paper that there's an opportunity with the reform of the RMA, that there may be an opportunity to address, nearly going through the courts it hasn't got this regional council anyway, but there may be an opportunity, should the government be engaged on it, to perhaps engage on the definition of a braided river and things through national planning reforms.
I'll take my questions or call the question. Amendments.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I see that. Okay.
John, it's really just in relation to the last point that Lee made about going away, and Catherine, I suppose, going away and following up on what other actions could be taken. I'd like that added to that number 2, if we could. So it would be notes of the report, blah, 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 engage through national planning reforms, as well as do further work on what other actions can be taken about this issue or something like that. I don't know. I haven't got quite the last bit of that, but I just think it'd be good to have that reflected as an action so that we can then follow up on that. Or make it a number 3, as Jan suggested.
I'm just wondering, are we really asking for some information about how we can deliver on those 2 items that Phil's just been talking about? How do we address that? Is that what you're, addressing the RPS and addressing the CWMS or not?
Yeah, I quite like what Grant's just said about further options to address. Is it compliance with
CWMS in our regional policy statement regarding natural character.
I'll need a seconder too if I'm able. But through the chair, I suppose. Sorry.
Could I suggest that it's a 3, just because it says it's just noting stuff. So maybe 3 investigates further options.
Yes, I'm happy.
It's an actual action. Yeah, cool.
I'm happy with that, and then you can pass 2 without any trouble. Yeah. So I'll propose an additional recommendation if that's okay, Ian. Sorry.
Can we just do a recess for like 2 minutes while we just capture this? Right, thank you.
We want to wrap up now, really. So I'm going to put the first 2 notes, and Phil and John moved and seconded that we adopt the first 2 notes, so notes 1 and 2. All in favour of that, please say aye. Now, Craig has proposed a third recommendation that we investigate further options to address CWMS and the Canterbury Regional Policy Statement to preserve the natural character of braided rivers. What I'm not sure is what it's amending, but it's an addition. But yes.
In that conversation last week. Yeah.
Options and action.
There's a starting space.
No, that's how you pronounce Canterbury. We're into phonetic spelling here. Okay, so Craig, you're proposing that amendment.
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
John Sunkel has seconded that. All in favour of the amendment, please say aye. Aye. It now becomes the substantive recommendation. Is there any further discussion? Do we have to get another mover and seconder?
We'll stay the same.
Stay the same. I'll put the amendment as the substantive motion, please, recommendation, I should say. Please, all in favour, please say aye. Aye. Against? Carried. Thank you.
Okay.
And I did have a proposal that perhaps we recommend to the Natural Environment Committee that we recommend to our biodiversity officers they engage with willing landowners. So is there any? Can you put that up on the screen? There was a proposed recommendation. That's not. So, I mean, it seemed to me that this was triggered by this Braided Rivers report, because it seemed to me that actually the rivers have reclaimed a lot of the river margin that farmers had tried to take from the rivers. And there is, and my observation is there's still quite an opportunity to assist, to encourage farmers to, rather than just put everything back the way it was, to actually look at the new form of some of their riparian land. Absolutely.
Yeah, John's ready to go.
Yes.
Yeah, looks good. I would just say, just so that we're not potentially making it sound like we think we can just sort of tell them what to do, which we know we can't. Just consider, within, and the point of saying that is it just means like within their existing, that we're acknowledging that they have existing work programs, and it's about considering it within those.
Is this to our biodiversity office, you mean? Or with the
Yeah.
landowners?
Consider.
For the NEC to consider, do you mean?
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't note that the recommendation was to the NEC committee.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that the biodiversity officers consider engaging with willing landowners.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Okay.
A simpler way, rather than sort of designating it to staff, is if we just say, just set staff, but we just say that staff consider. Staff can go away. So, it's just more general.
Yep, staff consider, yep. Okay. And right, that's cool, that's good enough, because it's gonna go to NEC, they can rework it and do whatever they want with it. I'll move that from the chair, Sunkel will second that. Moved and seconded, any further discussion? All in favour, please say aye. Against, carried, thank you. Right, now. What are we up to now? Are there any other notices of motion? Is there any extraordinary and urgent business? The next meeting will be held in 2022. Lana's going to do a closing for Cara Care. Or do I close the meeting first?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I'll close the meeting. Thank you for your attendance. I'm sorry it's taken an hour longer than I planned.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. And we'll close with karakia. Unuhia, 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 ki te uru tapu nui o tāna. Kia wātia, mama, tunako, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takata. Koia rā I rongo, whakairia, ake ki runga, kia tina, tina. Homie, huie, tai kie. Kia ora.